I remember the day the water stopped feeling like a convenience and started feeling like survival. It was mid-July when the heat dome settled over our county. Not a cloud in the sky for weeks. The grass on every lawn crisped into a brittle brown tree bark began to crack, and local news ran red warnings about conserving water and checking on elderly neighbors. I lived just past the cul-de-sac, in a modest one-story home on the edge of the Oak Ridge community, an HOA-run suburban cluster that prided itself on its lush lawns and cookie-cutter conformity. I wasn't originally part of the HOA. My property had been part of the old, unincorporated zone before the development expanded and enveloped the area. I had negotiated grandfathered rights when I bought the house rights that allowed me certain freedoms. At least that's what I believed. The heat wave triggered something in me. Maybe it was my years in the service, or maybe it was remembering how my mother's oxygen tank once failed during a blackout and no one came to help. Either way, I couldn't watch my neighbors, many of them older, living on fixed incomes, risk dehydration and heat stroke. So I took action. I installed 3 55-gallon rain barrels next to my garage black polymer drums with filtration spouts. I had picked them up from an agricultural supply store I used to frequent back when I did volunteer emergency response in Arizona. Alongside the barrels, I ran a simple gravity-fed hose system to a small tap by the driveway. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't hidden. But it worked. I posted a sign on a plywood board. Emergency water free. Limit 2 gal per visit. For elderly neighbors and pets. Stay safe. Jack. At first, it was just Mrs. Delaney from across the street. She shuffled over in a sun hat and old slippers holding a plastic milk jug. Then came Mr. and Mrs. Sakamoto, a retired couple whose air conditioning had given out. After 2 days, I had set up a small pop-up canopy tent with chairs and a cooler of ice to give folks a place to rest. People brought their own containers. Some donated ice packs. Others helped refill the barrels from their own dwindling reserves. I wasn't running a business. I wasn't charging a cent. I wasn't even storing city water, only harvested rainwater and emergency stored reserves I had pumped from a legal borehole years ago and kept for disasters. But none of that mattered to the HOA. I noticed the black SUV circling slowly around the third day the water station was up. Tinted windows, clipboard in the front seat. I recognized the silhouette behind the wheel immediately, Karen Winslow, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Tall, brittle-looking, with the kind of permanently puckered mouth that suggested every passing second pained her soul. She didn't get out. She just rolled slowly by, phone raised, snapping photos. I should have known what was coming. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the heat eased its chokehold just slightly, I found an envelope duct-taped to my front door. The HOA's seal. A thick packet of single-spaced type and legal threats. The letter cited violation of community guidelines related to unauthorized utility structures, non-conforming water features, and public resource distribution without HOA approval. They demanded I dismantle the system immediately or face daily fines. I sat on the porch and read the whole thing twice. It felt like being slapped by bureaucracy. I wasn't angry yet, just stunned. The city had declared a drought emergency only days ago. The mayor was on local TV asking folks to help your neighbors and look out for the vulnerable. And here I was doing exactly that, being fined by an HOA obsessed with optics and petty control. That night, I walked into my garage, took out a pen, and wrote in block letters on the bottom of the plywood sign, "Approved by human decency." By morning, someone had torn it off. It was a thin, official, and cold. Not even a knock. Just a quiet slap of paper against wood, as someone, likely Karen herself, taped the notice to my door early that morning. The heat had not broken. The sun hadn't even risen fully yet. Sweat was already forming on my neck as I peeled the envelope free and stood in my doorway in silence. Notice of infraction. The top line read in bold-centered type. Underneath it, a string of violations spelled out in dense paragraphs, as if my humble water station had shaken the foundation of suburban law. The phrasing was bureaucratic and almost theatrical. Distribution of utility resources without board review. Installation of unsanctioned infrastructure, affecting visual harmony. Failure to obtain necessary modification approvals as per Articles 5.3 and 9.7 of the Oak Ridge Community Covenant. I could have laughed if it hadn't made my stomach twist. Stapled to the back was a color printout me handing a jug of water to Mr. Sakamoto, who looked like he could barely stand. Karen must have taken the photo from across the street, zoomed in from her SUV. My first thought was she didn't even bother to blur his face. My second was what kind of person photographs the elderly getting help and thinks it's a violation. They'd given me 48 hours to remove all unapproved structure signage and water containers or face escalating penalties. At the bottom, her signature. Karen Winslow, HOA President. Written in that tight, neat cursive, she probably practiced just for moments like this. I called City Hall again. This time, I asked to speak directly to the Emergency Services Coordinator, a no-nonsense woman named Tasha, whom I'd worked with during wildfire evacuations back in 2017. I explained the fines, the barrels, and the HOA's threats. Tasha was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, then asked, "Are you distributing city water?" "No," I said. "Rain catchment and privately stored, completely within regulation." "Then you're legal." That was all I needed to hear. I made another copy of the HOA letter, stapled the city's drought declaration behind it, and pinned it on the same post where my water sign used to be. Later that afternoon, as the sun blistered overhead and the asphalt shimmered like it was melting, Karen walked right up to that post with a pair of scissors. She clipped the documents clean off, folded them, and dropped them in a black trash bag she was carrying like it was evidence from a crime scene. Then, without a word, she pointed her phone at me, recording as I sat in my folding chair under the canopy with a cooler between my feet. "Do you have anything to say about your violations?" she asked, voice cold and clipped. "I have water," I said. "Do you need some?" "You are not funny, Mr. Harrison. This is not a joke." "No, it's a heat wave. That's what this is." She left without another word, heels clicking across the driveway like a gavel. By evening, I received the second notice. This time, it was heavier. A full packet. Violation, escalation day 2. Fine, $125. Violation code C4, unauthorized modification of property for public utility use. Cumulative penalty total, $200. That night, I sat at my desk flipping through the Oak Ridge HOA covenants and guidelines. I had a copy from when I bought the house, and I kept it not because I liked them, but because I knew that one day, maybe one day I'd need it. My property, according to the original county plat map, sat adjacent to the development zone, not within its bounds. The HOA had extended jurisdiction over several parcels through an amendment in 2009, but mine was not included in the original annexation. I was technically exempt from most aesthetic regulations, including landscaping uniformity and non-permanent outdoor fixtures. They had no right to fine me, but they didn't care about rights. They cared about power. I decided to test something. The next morning, I added a second sign, this time laminated in bold red letters. "My land is exempt. Emergency relief is legal. If you have a complaint, bring a court order." 3 hours later, my mailbox was stuffed with another envelope. No postage. Hand-delivered, a thicker packet. Emergency Committee review. Unanimous HOA vote for fines to continue. Suggested resolution removal by force if non-compliance continues. My stomach dropped. That wasn't just posturing anymore. That was a veiled threat. I went outside to cool off. It was ironic, trying to escape the heat by stepping into the inferno, but the house felt suffocating. As I sat on the front steps, I watched a young woman park across the street. She was new to the neighborhood, Claire, I think. I'd seen her once jogging with a little boy in a stroller. Today, she looked different, sweat-soaked, panicked. She rushed over holding an empty gallon jug. "I'm so sorry, do you still have water?" she asked, barely catching her breath. I nodded, of course. She didn't even try to explain, just whispered, "My husband's been out all day. We lost pressure an hour ago. I didn't know where else to go." I gave her 2 jugs. She cried. I didn't say much, just helped load them into the back of her hybrid and sent her off with a small Ziploc of ice I had stashed in the cooler. As she pulled away, I noticed Karen standing at the corner again. She wasn't even trying to hide. Her phone was up, pointed directly at my home. This time, she had back up a younger man in a blue HOA polo shirt, clipboard in hand, scribbling something down. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. That night, I dusted off a leather folder I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside was a wrinkled business card. Sheriff Marcus Devereaux, Semper Surveyor. We'd trained together once. He owed me a favor I never thought I'd need to collect. It was time to collect. By the third day of fines, my front yard looked less like a violation and more like a triage station. I had added a small whiteboard where people could write their names and the number of gallons they took just to keep it organized. I labeled it the honor list. No one took more than they needed. In fact, I was amazed at how many neighbors showed up just to drop off extra jugs, hand sanitizer, or even frozen water bottles. An older kid named Seth brought his dad's old camping cooler and asked, "Can we use this for medicine? If anyone needs to keep it cold." It was the kind of spirit I remembered from wildfires, hurricanes, that rare thread of humanity that surfaces only when everything else peels away. But not everyone was cheering. The fines had now reached $300 total. One for the barrels, one for the public dispensing of goods, another for the visual obstruction caused by the whiteboard and sign. I'd called the HOA hotline and left a voicemail after the second fine. I'd even emailed their general inbox with the scanned city ordinance, the drought order, and photographic proof that my property wasn't under their jurisdiction. No reply. Then came the letter from Karen personally. Unlike the form fines, this one was typed, printed on expensive parchment paper, and hand-signed in blue ink. She didn't bother with legalese. This time it was pure performance. Dear Mr. Harrison, your recent activities, though undoubtedly well-intentioned, have created disruption, confusion, and a general decline in community aesthetic. Your actions have inspired unauthorized behavior from other homeowners who believe rules are subjective. This cannot continue. I urge you to dismantle the structure immediately and demonstrate your commitment to order. Respectfully, Karen Winslow, Oak Ridge, HOA President. I don't know why, but that word order lit something in me. I wasn't angry at first. I wasn't even scared. I was insulted. Order. What kind of order punishes people for helping their neighbors during a heat emergency? I sat at my desk, breathing deep, fingers curled around the letter until the paper crumpled in my palm. I remembered the fire camp in Colorado, the refugee site in Louisiana. I remembered how many people I'd seen collapse from heat exhaustion, their faces slack and gray from dehydration. I remembered the day a 5-year-old girl died in her mother's arms because the local relief station had run out of clean water. I wasn't dismantling anything. That afternoon, I climbed up a stepladder and hung an old American flag from the corner of my canopy. Not because I thought it would protect me, but because I wanted people to know this wasn't about rules, it was about something older, something deeper, something written not in HOA bylaws, but in marrow. I was standing in the driveway adjusting the flag when I saw the black Mercedes. It wasn't Karen's usual SUV. This one was newer, sleeker, the kind of vehicle someone buys when they want to be seen. The window rolled down and revealed a man I didn't recognize, tan skin, perfect haircut, aviator sunglasses. "Mr. Harrison," he asked. "That's me." He handed me a printed folder. "This is an official notice of hearing." Hearing for what? For willful noncompliance. The board will be reviewing your conduct in a special session Thursday at 6 p.m. You are encouraged to attend. I flipped through it. 3 pages of citations, photos of my setup, and a bolded recommendation for community-wide censure and fine escalation up to lien proceedings. Lion. That word hit differently. They were threatening my home, my land. I walked back into the garage and pulled out the folder I hadn't opened in years. It still smelled like cedar from when I built the shelves. Inside the deed, my county plat map. The exemption letter signed by the county planning director in 2011. My utility bills with their own separate account numbers. Everything proving that Oak Ridge HOA had no legal authority over my lot. But I knew that wasn't enough. They were counting on me backing down anyway. That evening, I called Sheriff Marcus Devereaux. It had been 8 years since we last spoke. The man had climbed ranks fast, was now county sheriff after decades of working his way through patrol search and rescue, then fire investigations. We'd served together on a special interagency task force during one of the worst fire seasons on record. When he picked up, his voice was tired but steady. "Harrison," he said, "you're alive." Barely. And apparently violating multiple aesthetic codes. He laughed once. "What's going on?" I explained everything. The barrels, the signs, the fines, the veiled threats. I kept it simple, but I didn't hold back. There was a pause. Are you within city code? Yes, I even got confirmation from Tasha at Emergency Services. Do they have jurisdiction over your property?
No.
And are you distributing city water? Only rain catchment and private reserve. He exhaled into the phone. That's what I thought. I'm not asking for favors, I said. But I figured you should know what's happening before this turns into something ugly. There was a longer pause. I imagined him leaning back in his worn chair at the county office, pinching the bridge of his nose like he used to when someone brought him a dumb case. You free tomorrow around 11, he asked.
Yeah.
I'll stop by. That was all he said before hanging up. The next morning, I made sure everything was clean, tidy, legal. I printed the declarations again and taped them where Karen couldn't reach. I stood at the end of my driveway and waited, sweat soaking through my shirt collar, watching the street curve like a baited hook toward the future. At exactly 11:06 a.m., a white Ford Explorer with a gold sheriff's badge on the side rolled into the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peered through blinds. Kids on bikes slowed down. Karen emerged from her garage in a sharp navy dress like she had been waiting for a parade. The door opened. Sheriff Marcus stepped out, aviators in place badge glinting under the brutal summer sun. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked straight at me and said, "Let's take a look." Sheriff Marcus walked with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who didn't need to prove authority. Someone who was authority. His boots crunched on the sun-baked gravel as he approached the barrels beside my garage. He didn't say a word at first, just bent down and ran a hand along the spigot of the rain catchment barrel, checking for leaks or tampering. Karen hovered nearby, clutching a leather binder like it contained the 10 Commandments. "Sheriff Devereaux," she began with a strained smile, "thank you for responding so quickly. We've been dealing with a rather unfortunate breach of community code." Marcus stood and turned to her without even raising an eyebrow. "Is this your property?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Well, no, but it's part of our HOA jurisdiction." Mr. Harrison signed a compliance acknowledgement when he purchased. "No, I didn't." I cut in, stepping beside him. "My property was exempted. County records confirm it. I can show you the documents." Karen's jaw twitched. "I have the letter from 2011, signed by Planning Director Susan Valenti. There's also the parcel map, the utility variance, and—" I know Marcus interrupted, his tone level. "I pulled your file this morning." Karen's smile curdled. Then perhaps she said, voice rising ever so slightly, "You're unaware of the visual disruption this setup causes. We've had multiple complaints from homeowners about the—" "Who?" Marcus asked. "Excuse me. Who filed complaints?" She hesitated. "Well, I did. And so did Michael Reyes. And Linda Zhao mentioned it in a group email. So 3. Out of how many?" Karen's lips pressed into a line. "It's the principle of the thing." He turned back to the barrels. "You got overflow protection." "Yes," I said. "And mosquito netting under the lid. Any runoff into the storm drain?" "No. Everything stays within the gravel bed. I had the trench dug 2 years ago." He looked around. "No signage advertising sales, no posted hours, no money changing hands. Nothing." I confirmed. Karen's voice sharpened. "This isn't about sales. It's about unapproved utilities, about operating outside of aesthetic uniformity, and we've issued formal citations." "You mean fines?" I said, stepping forward. "Fines you have no legal right to impose." Karen's binder snapped open. "This community," she declared, "has clear binding expectations regarding appearance, conduct, and order. If every homeowner started erecting temporary structures and handing out materials without authorization, we'd fall into chaos. You're undermining the values this neighborhood was built on." "No," Marcus said, voice calm but cold. "He's embodying the values this country was built on." Karen stiffened. He reached into his own folder, standard manila, and pulled out a single-page printout. "As per Section 16C of the County Emergency Act, private citizens may store and distribute emergency supplies during officially declared crises without regulatory penalty, provided no financial transaction is involved and public safety isn't compromised. That includes water." He handed the page to her. She took it like it burned. "This supersedes your HOA regulations for the duration of the declared emergency," he added. "And since your HOA does not hold legal jurisdiction over Mr. Harrison's property, any enforcement you attempt will be treated as harassment and possibly trespassing." Her face flushed bright red, but she kept her composure. "We have every right to maintain community standards, but not at the expense of legality or decency." She glared at me like I'd just dragged mud through her living room. "Mark my words," she hissed. You think you've won something here, but you've only stirred dissent. You're encouraging others to defy order. Good, I said. Maybe order needs to be defied once in a while. She stormed off, heels stabbing the pavement like accusations. Marcus watched her go before turning to me. You should still be careful, he said. She's got the kind of pride that festers. I know. He looked at the barrels again. You're doing a good thing, Jack. Just don't let it eat you alive. I won't, I said. But I might let it eat her pride. He chuckled, slapped me once on the back, and left. For a few hours, it was quiet. People came and went, thanked me softly, left ice packs or spare containers in return. The barrels stayed full thanks to the system I'd rigged from my reserve tank in the garage. I rationed, carefully logging every gallon dispensed. My whiteboard was now 2 pages long. Then the mailbox screamed again. Inside, another fine. But this one was different. Citation: unauthorized display of political materials. Fine, $200. Violation: flying a flag without permit. I stood there holding the paper in disbelief. They were fining me. For the flag, I walked straight to the flagpole, climbed the ladder, and replaced the American flag with a bright yellow one I hadn't flown since my last deployment. And don't tread on me. The next morning, 2 more fines. $250. Noise disturbance due to increased foot traffic. $175 littering due to a plastic jug left near the curb. They were stretching, and I could feel it. The fines weren't about enforcement anymore. They were about intimidation, about breaking me down one absurd charge at a time. But I wouldn't break. I printed each new fine, laminated it, and stapled it to the front fence with a note. This is what control looks like. Neighbors started to take notice. Claire came by again, this time with her husband. They brought 2 gallons of filtered water and a fan they didn't need. Mrs. Sakamoto brought ginger tea and sat with me under the canopy for 20 minutes just to make them uncomfortable. Kids dropped off art drawings of water, rain barrels, flags. By evening, someone had slipped a folded piece of paper into my mailbox. No signature, just one sentence written in tight, anxious print. We're with you. Let us know what to do. 2 days later, I caught them on my security camera. It was just after midnight when 2 HOA board members, Michael Reyes, and someone I didn't recognize, slipped onto my property with flashlights. They wore matching polo shirts, as if embroidered logos could make trespassing legal. One of them held a clipboard, the other carried a tape measure. They moved straight to my barrels, whispering, glancing around, occasionally pointing at the camera mounted above my garage, pretending not to see it. The audacity was almost impressive. They took photos, measured the distance from the barrels to the property line, took notes like they were building a case for a grand jury. One of them even walked around to the back of my house, behind my fence, and tried the gate. When it didn't budge, he shook it twice before giving up. Then, as quickly as they came, they disappeared into the night. I reviewed the footage 3 times, then emailed it to myself from 3 different accounts. I wasn't going to let them twist this into some inspection. They had entered my property without permission during the night while I was asleep. That wasn't governance, it was surveillance. The next morning, I forwarded the footage to Sheriff Marcus. No words, just the file and the timestamp. By 9:00 a.m., I got a reply. Got it. Already had my suspicions. Give me a day. I knew what that meant. Karen and her board had crossed a line, and Marcus wasn't going to let them wriggle off it. Still, they weren't done. An hour later, another notice was taped to my door. Not mailed, not emailed, hand-delivered by Karen herself. I opened the door just in time to see her walking away down my driveway, phone in hand, her eyes flicking back toward me without stopping. She didn't say a word. The paper she left behind was different this time. Thicker. Glossy HOA letterhead. Gold foil seal on the corner. Notice of community infraction hearings. They were summoning me. Thursday night, 6 p.m., Oak Ridge Community Clubhouse. Mandatory appearance. Agenda. Endangering the community through unauthorized distribution of resources, causing visual and physical nuisance, and encouraging defiance of governance. The language had changed. No longer about water. Now it was about me. They weren't just trying to find me anymore. They were trying to make me a pariah. I stared at the paper for a full minute before walking it to the barrel station and stapling it to the signpost. Next to it, I added a note in red marker. Public invited. The neighbors noticed. That day, more than 30 people came by. Some just to read the sign, others to shake my hand or drop off more jugs. A few lingered. Mrs. Delaney brought her folding chair and umbrella and sat with me for an hour just to hold space. She didn't say much, just hummed softly, like her presence alone was resistance. At 3 p.m., I saw a white van roll by. Unmarked, slow. It stopped 2 houses down, where a couple of HOA board members stood talking on the sidewalk. They approached the van. A man stepped out with a clipboard and a measuring wheel. Code enforcement. Likely from the city, though it could have just as easily been someone hired by the HOA. I watched them through binoculars from behind my curtains. They spent 15 minutes talking with Karen. She kept pointing in my direction. Eventually, the man with the clipboard approached my property line, but never stepped across. Smart. I knew how these things worked. They wanted to rattle me, provoke a reaction, make me look unreasonable so they could control the narrative at the hearing. But I didn't bite. I had something better than anger. I had evidence, and I had allies. At dusk, I walked down the street to the old post box at the edge of the community entrance. The HOA used it to post announcements, lawn service updates, and pool cleaning schedules. I pinned my own flyer next to theirs. Public hearing on Thursday. The HOA is trying to find me for helping my neighbors during a drought. You're invited. You have a voice. Jack Harrison. I didn't know if it would change anything, but I knew this much silence was their weapon, and I refused to give them that. That night, the wind shifted. Literally. The forecast warned of a dry front, bringing even hotter air from the south. Temperatures were expected to rise into triple digits by the weekend. The city renewed the drought emergency and issued a Stage 3 water alert. No outdoor watering, no car washing, no sprinklers. Ironically, my barrels harvested before the restrictions were now one of the only legal sources of stored water in the neighborhood. The next morning, someone poured bleach into them. All 3. I found the sludge at dawn. White chemical streaks floating in the surface like oil. A sharp artificial stink that burned the back of my throat. The gravel bed had been soaked too, acidic puddles eating through the fabric lining I'd laid to prevent erosion. It wasn't a warning. It was sabotage. I stared at the damage in stunned silence, fists clenched, mind blank. Then I turned slowly toward my garage camera. Rewound the feed. 1:42 a.m. A figure in a hoodie. Gloves. Moving low and fast. They carried something likely the jug I now found crumpled behind my trash bin. A bleach bottle. Store brand. I downloaded the footage. Sent it to Marcus again. Then I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I opened the old lockbox from my service years. Pulled out the pocket recorder. The one I used to train firefighters on arson scene documentation. It still worked. I tested the mic, charged the battery, and placed it in the canopy pointing toward the driveway. If they wanted a war of documentation, I'd show them how it was done. By noon, the sheriff replied, "Got it. This changes everything. I'm coming Thursday." I smiled for the first time in 2 days. They thought they could drown me in paper, but I was made of fire. The day of the hearing arrived like a bruise, slow-spreading, sore, and unavoidable. From the moment I woke up, I could feel the tension pressing against the walls of my house. The air outside was hotter than usual, dry and electric, as if the wind itself held its breath. I hadn't slept well, not because I feared what would happen that night, but because something deeper inside me was shifting. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about control, about decency, about the soul of a neighborhood where people were afraid to speak up unless someone else went first. That morning, I checked the barrels again, still tainted. I had them roped off signs marked contaminated, do not use, and called a hazmat cleanup crew I used to work with during wildfire responses. They promised to send someone by next week. Meanwhile, I left a new sign at the station. Water suspended due to sabotage. You can thank your HOA. I didn't need to name names. Everyone already knew who held the matches. Just before noon, my phone buzzed. A number I hadn't seen in years, but one I recognized immediately. Marcus. His voice came in steady, still standing. Barely, I said, but upright. You got a minute? I got 1,000. I just got off the phone with the county DA's office. They want to know if you're willing to press charges. That hit harder than I expected. For the bleach and the trespassing. We have 2 separate incidents now, enough footage to justify intent. I exhaled slowly. Let's hold for now. Let them show their hands first. There was a pause. You sure? I want them exposed, not imprisoned, not yet. He didn't argue. I'll be there tonight, he said. Uniform, sidearm, badge in full display. Why, I asked. You don't need to dress up. I want them to know who's watching. At 4 p.m., I sat down to write a statement. Nothing long, just a single page. I didn't trust that they'd let me speak freely at the meeting, and I needed something that would cut through the noise if I lost the floor. I printed 10 copies, folded them neatly, labeled the envelopes, "For neighbors who still care." Then I changed into the button-down shirt. Not pressed, not fancy, just clean. My old service boots stayed on even if they squeaked a little from the heat-dried leather. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at myself, sun-scarred skin, crow's feet, and silver hair that used to be fire black. The years had made me harder, but not meaner. I was still that same man who once crawled into a collapsed barn to rescue an old farmer after a flood. Still the man who handed out water bottles to strangers in Louisiana, while FEMA fumbled on TV. They could find me. They could lie about me. But they couldn't unmake me. At 5:30, I started walking. The Oak Ridge Community Clubhouse was 6 blocks away, nestled behind rows of identical houses, with fake shutters and lawns trimmed like regulation haircuts. Along the sidewalk, people stood on their porches watching. A few waved. Some gave nods. A couple looked away. But what struck me was who followed. One by one, neighbors joined me. Mrs. Delaney limping but resolute. Claire pushing her baby in a stroller. Seth, the teenage boy with the cooler. By the time I turned the last corner, we were at least 20 strong. No signs, no chanting. Just a quiet procession of people, tired of being managed instead of respected. The clubhouse sat low and flat, painted an institutional beige that felt more like surrender than design. Outside, 2 HOA security volunteers stood nervously by the door, radios clipped to their belts, eyes darting. When they saw Marcus behind me, full sheriff's uniform, weapon holstered, badge gleaming, they stepped aside. Inside the room was cooler, but not friendlier. Rows of chairs filled the space, most already taken by HOA loyalists or residents who had come out of curiosity. At the front sat Karen and 4 other board members behind a long table with plastic name tags and water bottles, as if this were a courtroom instead of a shakedown. Karen wore a dark blazer over a pastel blouse, pearls nestled around her neck like a noose she hadn't noticed tightening. When she saw me walk in with Marcus behind me and neighbors fanning out into the rows, something in her posture changed. Her spine straightened, but her shoulders tightened. She wasn't expecting backup. Definitely not a sheriff in full regalia. I took my seat in the front row. At 6:01 p.m., she banged a wooden gavel like she was presiding over a trial and began, "This special session of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association is now in order." The first and only item on the agenda is the case of Mr. Jack Harrison regarding his repeated violations and failure to comply with community guidelines during a period of heightened regulation. She paused, letting the words linger. I didn't flinch. The board has documented numerous infractions, she continued, including unauthorized water distribution, temporary structures, environmental disruption, and improper display of political materials. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison's actions have inspired unregulated activity across the community, jeopardizing the collective harmony we strive to maintain. Her voice was syrupy with fake concern, but her eyes gleamed with personal vendetta. We will now open the floor for board statements, after which Mr. Harrison will have an opportunity to respond. She turned to the first man beside her, Michael Reyes, who began reading from a pre-written script, listing fines, citing HOA code numbers, and gesturing toward printed photos stapled to a thick manila folder. He barely looked up, as if reciting from a playbook. I watched the audience. Some nodded absently, others looked bored, but a few, Mrs. Delaney, Claire, Seth, stared straight ahead, eyes locked, jaws firm. When they finally gave me the floor, Karen made a show of glancing at the clock. You'll have 3 minutes. I stood, slowly unfolded one of my letters, and looked her dead in the eye. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just say this. I turned to the room. My name is Jack Harrison. I served 22 years as a firefighter. I have pulled children out of collapsed attics, held the hands of men who died trying to save animals, and I have risked my life in more emergencies than I can count. I did not expect to fight another one. In my own neighborhood, a heat emergency that threatened the lives of your parents, your children, your pets. I held up the photo of the bleach bottle, the one I found behind my trash bin. This was poured into my water barrels 2 nights ago. Water meant for your families, your friends, water given freely. Gasps rippled across the room. I have footage. I have timestamps, and I have the full backing of Sheriff Marcus Devereaux and emergency services, all confirming that what I did was not only legal, it was right. Marcus stepped forward slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was confirmation enough. Karen tried to speak, but I raised a hand. One last thing I said. I looked at the board, each face one by one. You don't speak for this community. You manage papers. You send letters. You threaten and fine. But you don't speak for us. Not anymore. Then I folded the letter, turned, and sat down. The room stayed silent for a moment too long. And then softly at first came applause. It grew louder, stronger, steady. Not a roar, a rumble. The sound of control cracking. By the time the applause faded, the mood inside the Oak Ridge Community Clubhouse had shifted. You could feel it in the way people sat up straighter in the sidelong glances, exchanged across rows of plastic chairs. Even those who'd come out of idle curiosity were now watching closely, reassessing everything they thought they knew about their HOA and about me. Karen didn't like it. She tried to regain control, banging the gavel again, a bit harder this time. This is not a public forum, she snapped. We are here to address formal infractions. Not, she gestured vaguely toward me, grandstanding. Marcus finally stepped forward then. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I'd like to speak, he said. Karen stuttered. Sheriff Devereaux, this is a private association meeting. And you extended a summons to a citizen who lives outside your jurisdiction, he replied calmly. You publicly accused him of endangering the community. You invited witnesses. Now you're going to let him have a fair response. He paused. Unless you're prepared to remove me. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. The rest of the board looked at one another, suddenly less certain of their authority. You have 2 minutes, she finally said, but the tremor in her voice gave her away. Marcus turned to the crowd. My name is Marcus Devereaux. I've been sheriff of this county for 6 years. Before that, I worked fire suppression, search and rescue, and incident command across 3 states. I'm not here as Jack's friend, though I am that proudly. I'm here because a few days ago, a private citizen forwarded me video footage of 2 individuals trespassing on his property at night. A day later, he sent me proof of deliberate sabotage bleach poured into clean drinking water during a level 3 drought emergency. A hush fell over the room. Marcus continued. I verified his documentation. I confirmed his exemption from HOA jurisdiction with the county. I reviewed local code and emergency regulations. Mr. Harrison did nothing wrong. In fact, what he did may have saved lives. He looked directly at Karen now. What's happening here is not enforcement. It's harassment. It's intimidation. And it's been done under the guise of authority that doesn't legally exist on his land. Karen opened her binder. We have bylaws, which do not supersede county or state emergency protocols. Nor do they permit criminal acts of trespassing or sabotage. Those are prosecutable offenses. The air turned heavy. Behind me, I heard someone whisper, she's finished. Marcus stepped back. I won't tell you how to run your meetings, but I will tell you this: if you continue targeting residents for acts of basic human decency, especially during an emergency, you'll be dealing with more than just a sheriff's visit. He left it at that. Silence held the room for nearly a full minute. Then Claire stood up from the third row. I got water from Jack, she said clearly. My infant had a fever. Our plumbing had failed. He gave us what we needed with no questions and no cost. That's not a violation. That's being a neighbor. More voices followed. I came by too. He saved my husband from heat stroke. My sister uses that cooler for insulin now. He even gave my kid a fan. Who else did that? Within seconds, the room had become something entirely different. Not a tribunal, not a courtroom. A reckoning. Karen tried to gavel them back into order. This meeting is adjourned. No, came a voice from the back. It was Mr. Wilkes, an old-timer who had lived in Oak Ridge since before it had gates. He stood slowly, a walking stick in one hand, a folder in the other. I motioned to call for an emergency community vote, he said. Karen froze. Wilkes raised his voice, per the bylaws. Article 11, Section C, we can motion for a board vote if a quorum is present and residents feel the board has acted inappropriately. Murmurs swept the crowd. People were already pulling out their phones, checking the clause. A young woman 2 rows over called out, "We have quorum." Karen looked at the rest of the board, her mask of control crumbling. This isn't the time. But it was too late. The motion passed by a show of hands. And just like that, the residents of Oak Ridge had turned the gavel around. That night, a petition began circulating. I didn't organize it. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. But I read every name that did. 93 signatures in under 48 hours. Enough to trigger a board review. Enough to push for resignation votes. Enough to demand transparency on how fines were issued and who approved after-hours surveillance. Karen, once untouchable, now avoided eye contact when she passed people on the street. The next week, Marcus came by my house again. He wasn't in uniform this time, just jeans, a t-shirt, and that same calm expression he wore during wildfires. He carried a cooler with Gatorade and a set of gloves. "You still cleaning up the barrels?" he asked. "Yeah, takes a while to neutralize bleach." He handed me a jug of fresh water. "Figured you'd want something clean in the meantime." I took it heart-heavy in the best way. "Thanks, brother." He glanced at the now empty canopy, the whiteboard still up, the faded note about sabotage. "You know," he said, "I think people needed this more than you realized." "Needed what?" "A reason to stand up." We sat for a while under the shade of the garage, sipping Gatorade like old men on a porch. Neighbors passed and waved. A few stopped to ask questions, to thank me, to leave another signed letter or copy of the petition. I didn't lead anything. I didn't give speeches. I just stayed visible, stayed human. Because sometimes that's all people need to believe they're allowed to care. The HOA hadn't stopped entirely. They still sent notices, still tried to collect on the fines. But the letters were more cautious now, worded like apologies, dressed in legal formality. And as for Karen, 3 weeks later, she stepped down for personal reasons. She didn't say goodbye, but her silence was a kind of surrender. The resignation didn't come with fireworks. No press release, no neighborhood-wide announcement, just a single line in the HOA newsletter wedged between lawn maintenance reminders and a note about recycling bins. Karen Winslow has resigned from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. No explanation, no farewell, just an ending. But the silence she left behind didn't last long, because the damage had already been done and people had questions. Lots of them. In the days that followed, the mood in Oak Ridge began to shift. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now spoke freely, unburdened by fear. Conversations happened on porches, over hedges, by mailboxes. You could feel the air thick with stories. "I got fined last spring for planting lavender in the front yard," one woman told me. Karen said it attracted bees and might trigger allergies. "They tried to charge me for a security camera because it disrupted visual cohesion," another neighbor said. "I repainted my shutters after that hailstorm, exact same color, still got a notice." Every story came with a look, the kind people give when they finally realize they weren't crazy, that it really had been happening. That control had crept in like smoke, and no one had screamed fire until it choked the whole room. One night, I got a knock on my door. It was Linda Zhao. She had always been polite but distant, the kind of neighbor who waved but never lingered. That night, though, she carried a thick folder in her arms and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested in months. "I thought you should see this," she said. Inside the folder were copies of emails, lots of them, between Karen and other board members, between Karen and private contractors, between Karen and, this one stunned me, local developers. They detailed things I hadn't expected. Discussions about rezoning parcels, increasing HOA control boundaries, targeting non-compliant lots for acquisition. My property had been on that list. Highlighted, circled. She was planning something bigger, Linda said. They wanted to create a corridor of enhanced value homes, move out anyone who didn't fit the image. Enhanced value was code for displacement, control masked as improvement, profit disguised as policy, and I had gotten in the way. That explained the escalation, the bleach, the trespassing, the desperate hearing. It wasn't about water. It was about removing an obstacle, me, before I could ruin their plans. The next HOA meeting wasn't special or dramatic. It was quiet. A Tuesday evening gathering, same room, different energy. A temporary chairperson, a man named Howard Sims, had taken over a gentle retiree who once ran logistics at the airport. His hands trembled slightly when he held the microphone. "I'd like to open the floor to public comment," he said. People hesitated, unused to being invited. Then Claire stood. She told them about the night her infant had a fever and her husband was out of town, and I gave her water that saved their child from heat stroke. Mr. Sakamoto spoke about how he fainted in his garage and was revived because I had installed a misting fan he could use in the heat. Mrs. Delaney cried. When she told the room she thought she'd die that week if someone hadn't noticed her gasping on her porch and handed her a cold bottle from my cooler. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The room spoke for me. And then Howard did something I'll never forget. He stood, cleared his throat, and said, "There is a difference between power and responsibility." Karen confused the two. "It won't happen again." Applause didn't erupt. Instead, heads nodded slowly. It was better that way. From that night forward, the tone of everything changed. New rules were proposed. Fines required board votes. All complaints had to be accompanied by written context and be available for public review. They even formed a new committee, Neighborhood Resilience, to plan for emergencies and ensure people like me had backup. A month later, I was asked to join that committee. I declined, not because I didn't want to help, but because I knew my role wasn't in the meetings or the motions. It was in being visible, available, human. I repaired the barrels, ordered new filters. This time, I painted them white with the words, "Community Water," in bold blue lettering. The first day I reopened them, I didn't even have to announce it. People came on their own. Some brought reusable jugs, others just to say hi. A kid brought me a handmade thank you card with crayon raindrops and the words, "Mr. Jack makes people not thirsty." Later that week, a reporter from the local paper showed up. She asked if I wanted to do an interview. I said no. She asked why. Because this isn't a story I told her. It's a reminder. She tilted her head of what? That sometimes standing your ground isn't about being right. It's about making space for others to breathe. She wrote that down anyway, and somehow it ended up as the headline. Not long after Karen left Oak Ridge altogether, her house went up for sale and no one wept. There was no drama. Just a quiet moving van, one Saturday morning, and a silence that felt more like peace than loss. I stood on my porch and watched it all, box after box, plant after plant, as she disappeared from the place she once ruled like a queen. When the van finally pulled away, I saluted softly, not with spite, but with finality. Not every battle ends in cheers. Some end in quiet exits and steadier ground. And for the first time in a long while, Oak Ridge felt like a neighborhood again. By autumn, the barrels weren't just barrels anymore. They were a symbol of resistance, of unity, of what could happen when people decided they were done being told to stay silent. The days of whispered complaints and secret fines were gone. Oak Ridge had changed, and for once, it hadn't been through a policy memo or a budget vote. It had changed because enough people saw injustice and stood still long enough to say no more. The HOA board didn't collapse overnight. Institutions like that never do. They crumble slowly like a termite-eaten fence, quietly from the inside. But the rot was visible now, and people weren't afraid to call it out. Howard Sims remained acting president, but even he admitted publicly that the previous board had abused procedural discretion and allowed certain personalities to dominate decision-making unchecked. A formal audit was requested by the community, not the board. And when the third-party firm completed their review, the results were printed in full and taped to every HOA mailbox. 6 violations of due process. Dozens of fines issued outside legal scope, private HOA meetings held off record, and perhaps most damning of all evidence of financial mismanagement involving a now defunct landscaping contract that had paid 3 times the market rate. Karen's signature had been on all of it. The shock didn't wear off quickly. Some neighbors felt duped. Others felt ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. But there was no hunt for scapegoats. Instead, there was a slow and steady tide of accountability. I was invited to speak again, not at a hearing, at a potluck. It was hosted by a neighbor I barely knew, an elementary school teacher named Marisol. She lived 5 houses down and had quietly watched the entire saga unfold from behind her rose bushes. One day, she just walked over with a flyer and said, "We're having a neighborhood dinner. Bring something if you want. Bring nothing if you can't. Just come." That Saturday evening, I arrived with a crock pot of chili and found more than 50 people milling about her backyard. There were folding chairs and fairy lights, paper plates stacked high, children chasing each other barefoot across the grass. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't loud, but it felt real in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. Someone brought up the barrels and I braced myself, but instead of judgment, there were smiles. "You remember when the HOA tried to fine Jack for flying a flag," someone said. "I remember when he posted all the citations on his fence, like trophies," someone else laughed. And suddenly the story wasn't heavy anymore. It had become folklore, neighborhood myth, proof that you didn't have to yell to start a movement, you just had to stand. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. The community elected 3 new board members, people with no ties to the old power structure. One was a retired nurse, another a high school civics teacher, and the third, a software engineer who specialized in transparency tools. They promised fewer fines and more listening. No more after-hours notices. No more weaponized aesthetic codes. The biggest change came when the new board passed a motion titled the Good Neighbor Clause. It stated plainly, in the event of an emergency or declared disaster, any resident who offers aid resources or support to their neighbors shall not be subject to aesthetic citations, fines, or reprimands, provided their actions do not endanger life, property, or health. It passed unanimously. They named it unofficially the Jack Harrison Rule. I didn't ask for that. In fact, when they told me, I tried to decline. But Howard just smiled and said, "You didn't ask for this either, Jack. You earned it." The change wasn't just in policy. It was in tone. People talked to each other more, took walks, left baskets on porches. Kids made chalk drawings that didn't get scrubbed off by HOA volunteers. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. Not just in my house, in this place. One afternoon, I heard a knock. It was Claire holding her toddler, and beside her stood a man I didn't recognize. "This is my brother," she said, "Darren. He's a carpenter." Darren extended a hand. "She told me what you did. Said you gave her water when her kid was sick. I'd like to build you something, as thanks." I blinked. "You don't need to." "I want to," he said simply. "And I think the neighborhood does too." By week's end, 5 volunteers were in my backyard, digging out the foundation for a new shed. They framed it in 2 days, painted it sky blue. It stood beside the barrels like a quiet guardian. Inside, they installed shelves labeled bins, first aid, flashlights, fans, jugs, power banks. It became a tiny hub, the Oak Ridge Mutual Aid Station. No one made announcements. People just knew it was there. It stayed unlocked, and it stayed respected. Even the kids who once rolled their eyes at anything community-related started stopping by sometimes just to rest or fill a bottle. One of them left a note once written in smudged pencil on the corner of a pizza box. "This place feels like someone cares. Thank you." I kept that note, taped it inside the shed. And on the days when I wondered whether any of it had really mattered, whether the fines, the stress, the bleach, the meetings, the rage on those days, I'd sit in that little shed, read that note, and remember why I didn't back down. It was never about being right. It was about making room, making space, so someone else could believe they mattered too. The HOA still existed. It always would. But now it was just a group of neighbors doing paperwork, not a panel of overseers. And my home, it stayed mine. Undefeated, uncompromised, unyielding, just like it always should have been. Winter arrived slow and dry that year. The rains came late, just a few gentle showers in late December that dampened the soil but never filled the barrels. It didn't matter anymore. By then, the neighborhood had become its own reservoir, not just of water, but of kindness, of memory, of resolve. The shed stood clean and organized through the season, its shelves full, thanks to quiet contributions. Someone donated wool blankets. Another left battery-powered lanterns. One morning, I found a bundle of socks and a note. "In case someone forgets what warm feet feel like." It made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it reminded me of the way things used to be back when neighbors did things without needing recognition. Back when being a good human was just the default. My life didn't change in any grand cinematic way after the HOA war. I didn't run for office, or start a podcast, or write a book. I just kept living. Quietly. Fully. For the first time in years, I was proud of the silence. But the world around me noticed. One afternoon in January, I got a call from Tasha at Emergency Services. "We're creating a new volunteer preparedness network," she said. "Neighborhood-based, focused on drought resilience and disaster response." She paused. "We'd like you to lead it." I told her I'd think about it, and I did for days. Then one morning, I walked past the barrels clean, now capped, their spigots wrapped in insulation, and saw a woman standing quietly beside them. I didn't recognize her. She looked younger, early 30s, maybe dressed in hospital scrubs and carrying a thermos. She turned as I approached. "Are you Jack?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled faintly. "My name's Andrea. My mother was Mrs. Delaney." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "She passed away in November," Andrea said softly, peacefully, "at home." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm sorry. She was remarkable." Andrea nodded. "She told me about you. All of this. She said you reminded her what dignity looked like. That she wasn't invisible here." Andrea looked around at the barrels, the shed, the whiteboard, still standing now blank but sturdy. "She asked me to tell you thank you," she said. "Said you made her last summer feel like the world still had people worth believing in." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my eyes stinging in a way I hadn't allowed since the fires years ago. She asked me to give you something, Andrea added. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a folded note in shaky handwriting. Dear Jack, when the air was thick and my lungs failed, you gave me a reason to breathe. Not just from water, but from hope. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That kindness isn't a weakness. It's the strongest kind of resistance. Thank you. M. Delaney. I stood still for a long time after she left. Eventually, I laminated the letter and pinned it inside the shed next to the pizza box note. They belonged beside each other. Both truths. Both pieces of the story. Not long after I called Tasha back. I'll do it, I said. I'll help build the network. She didn't cheer. Just said I was hoping you would. Spring came slow but bright. The first good rain hit in mid-March, and I watched the gutters flow for the first time in months. The barrels filled halfway overnight, and the sound of water trickling down spouts was the sweetest symphony I'd heard in years. People came by again, not out of desperation this time, but out of habit, out of connection, out of ritual. We didn't need a crisis anymore to care about each other. The HOA board, now fully replaced, operated like it should have from the beginning. Low-profile, functional, boring in the best possible way. They handled maintenance, collected dues, printed newsletters about bake sales and pothole repairs. No one feared them. Karen was gone. Her house sold. Her name, like her power, had faded into the background hum of memory. And while some wounds still lingered, old scabs of distrust, they no longer festered. They healed. Because healing, I learned, doesn't always come with ceremony. Sometimes it's just a neighbor waving instead of walking by. A child drawing on the sidewalk without getting scolded. A barrel staying full untouched, because no one needs it, but they all know it's there. One day, Seth, the teenage kid who helped me during the worst of it, walked up and handed me a laminated poster. It read, Water, Justice, Peace. This land stood firm. This man stood firmer. He grinned. Thought you could hang it on the shed. I didn't say anything, just took it and nodded. Later that week, I did hang it. And underneath it, I added something of my own. If you ever need help, don't wait for permission. Just help. And if they fine you for it, call me. I never thought I'd become a symbol. And maybe I haven't. Maybe I'm just a guy with a hose and a little bit of backbone. But in a world where so many people are afraid to speak, afraid to stand, afraid to be, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's exactly how you change things. Not with anger, not with fists, but with presence, with stillness, with water, justice, and peace. And now, when I sit on my porch in the early morning light, a mug of coffee in hand, I hear the soft chatter of neighbors again. I see the shed, the barrels, the whiteboard. And I know this fight is over. But what it gave us, that lasts forever.